Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the very first session at the annual Digital Council Africa Fibre Connects conference. Over the next week, it'll be my pleasure to welcome some of the greatest minds from the continent to share their experiences from their perspective speciality areas with us. And of course, this very first session today is setting the bar quite high. The aim of this afternoon session is to consider some of the key markets on the African continent, how they're faring in terms of broadband penetration, what some of the potential obstacles to investment is, and to help navigate our understanding of the dynamics in these markets. And to do that, we have invited a few key speakers, which I'm sure, in fact, needs very little introduction. But for the sake of protocol, allow me to give a quick overview of their bios. So representing the West Africa chapter, and in particular, I guess Nigeria, is an old friend, Olusolo Teniola. He's a techie turned business leader with a proven track record in growing profitable revenues for companies. He's engaged in various telco-related projects out of Lagos in Nigeria. He began his career actually as a software engineer with a couple of major global corporations, names we all know, such as Vodafone, British Telecoms, and Nortel Networks. And after several years in that capacity, and as an architect consultant, he decided to make a move to the commercial side of the business. And he took on technical marketing and project management roles at both Cisco Systems and Lucent Technologies. This got him geared for the commercial side of the business, and he studied full-time at the University of Bath, gaining a Times Top 100 MBA, which opened the door to the leadership career that he subsequently embarked on. Olusola is also part of a high leverage network in Nigeria with strong connections with the Nigerian Regulatory Authority, as well as the Ministry of Communications and Digital Economy. And alongside them, he's helping to pave the way to real change in broadband and telecoms in Nigeria, improving the lives of the communities across the country. And then somebody that's been around for a really long time, very well-known, Andries Delpoort. Everybody will actually remember Andries from his life work at Vodacom, starting out in 1996 as a radio planning manager. And then he actually proceeded to work himself up the ranks to Group CTO, which position he took in 2011. And he actually held that position until his departure to CIVH at the end of May 2020. So those of you that read the African press would have taken note of that. There's a couple of notable things that most of us remember him for during his time at Vodacom. One of it was Vodacom becoming the first MNO to launch 4G in South Africa in 2012. And also the first operator in Africa to launch 5G in August 2018. He's got a BSc in electronic engineering and a master's in business leadership postgrad degree. And then, of course, leading the pack today is another person that needs no introduction, Bora Barliachi, the founder and CEO of Digital Things. They're an advisory firm focusing on the telecommunications sector in Africa, and a long-standing partner of the Digital Council, and this year the partner that did our annual research for us, which is really what this session is about. But just by way of quick introduction, Digital Things. So prior to Bora joining Digital Things, he was the head of Africa for the digital infrastructure practice at McDonald. Over 20 years international experience in the telco sector, covers emerging markets from Asia, Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe to the Middle East and Africa. Throughout his career, Bora successfully set up new businesses and practices, established and managed large project teams in emerging markets, pioneered strategic alliances and partnerships with both industry players and investors, and led the development of practical solutions to complex business challenges for many large corporates across the continent. Bora, it's a real pleasure to have you and our guests here this afternoon. I'm always intrigued when you tell me about all the countries that you've lived in. I think it's more than 12 countries in the world or something crazy that you've actually called home in your adult life. But I think I'm going to leave it up to you to tell us a little bit more and to take the reins over from here. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you very much, Juanita, for welcoming us, and very excited about this session. I'm looking forward to a very, very interesting discussion today. And as you mentioned, I mean, we have undertaken the research partner role for Digital Council Africa this year. And today we will discuss a bit more about experiences from the industry leaders on different parts of the continent in terms of understanding their view of how the digital infrastructure is progressing on the continent. To start with the conversation, I would like to put the foundation in to the conversation first, and I'll start with a very brief overview of the developments that we took note of in recent years, starting with the international submarine cable segment, where we have really seen a proliferation of number of submarine cables arriving to the continent, including the upgrades of the existing cables. At the moment, we are probably looking at a bit of oversupply of international capacity, indeed, with less than 10% of the design capacity being actively used, and more cables are announced to be deployed and arrive in coming years as well, including the very large cable systems led by the OTTs and cloud players such as Google Equano or to Africa systems. Now, that definitely benefited most of the coastal countries. However, I mean, what we see at the same time is limited pass of that benefit to inland locations, inland countries, as well as the populations that lives not on the coastal cities. The reason for that, I mean, despite the development and investment on national fiber backbones to get that capacity inland, that reach of the fiber either have been limited or the competition over there has been ineffective. So what we see is still a bit of a gap in terms of the fiber reach on the national layer. And when we get to the last mile, again, I mean, except few countries on the continent, we also see a lack of fixed broadband penetration on the continent, reaching to less than 5% of the households on the continent have a fixed connection, comparing to over 50% global benchmark. So we are still behind. So there is quite a lot to be done. So with that said, I think I will start with you, Olu, in terms of your experience in West Africa, because West Africa point of view, we have seen Nigeria, Ghana, Ivory Coast have multiple cable systems, more to arrive. I mean, to Africa, Equano, they will also land in coming years. New Glow cable is coming. We have seen quite a lot of developments in terms of indeed pioneering the tower transactions in South Africa, starting with Nigeria. And most of the West African countries have been active markets in, welcoming tower costs and opening that infrastructure up. At the same time, in recent days, we have seen quite a lot of interest and investment in data center space, particularly in Nigeria, Ivory Coast, Ghana, again, I mean, by the likes of main ones or rock centers, also attracting international investment as well. Yet at the same time, looking into other countries like Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Togo, I mean, there is still a big gap between these leading countries and other nations. So your view of the state of digital infrastructure in West Africa, and what are the challenges and opportunities over there?
Yeah, thanks, Bora, and thanks, Juanita, for bringing us together. Bora, yeah, you've landed on the right spot, and I think that your statement about some of the gaps that we're experiencing, especially the terrestrial fiber, has been an old story. I think back in 2010, especially when I was involved with a fiber company that was coming out of Nigeria, we had put fiber on the pylons, typically like Eskom. So we had fiber on the high tension volts infrastructure spanning the north of the country to the coastal lines of the country, trying to get into ECOWAS, going through Togo, Benin, to Ghana. We still see something of a mixed story. Where there are state-owned enterprises, unfortunately, they have been somewhat of the bottlenecks in terms of allowing competition to come into the country. So you look at Benin Telecom, for instance. I mean, there's no competition allowed in the country in terms of transmission. But if you come to Nigeria, for instance, and to a degree Ghana, but Ghana has sort of a fortunate position where they've been able to build their fixed backbone network like you see in more advanced countries. So there isn't, in my opinion, much more to do than what Vodafone has done in that country or the old Ghana Telecom. But in the case of Nigeria, where we had the collapse of the incumbent Nitel, there's been a big opportunity to open up that sector. It has been opened up, but it's coming with private sector money, and the private sector money follows where the opportunities lie. And the opportunities lie in the cities. I mean, any business plan that comes to Nigeria, if you don't mention Lagos, is in the business plan as far as international investors are concerned. So what you get the gluts that you referred to. We have currently 5 undersea cables shored in Lagos. And we can't seem to get that capacity. You said 10% lit, that is correct. You know, outside the north of Lagos. So what are we experiencing? We're experiencing the first revolution, and I will call it the first revolution in terms of, you know, back in 2010, we relied heavily on VSAT technology, satellite technology to carry out our traffic because we had Sat3 that was always either offline or out of service. Well, now we have the Glow ones, the main ones, and others like WAX and ACE. Now we are and obviously we're going to have a few more coming onto the shores, including Orange's attempt to also do some undersea cable and building some terrestrial cable. So yes, we sort of have this concentration of activity in Lagos, but then when you want to try to carry the traffic from Lagos to Abuja or Port Harcourt, which is the oil city in Nigeria, there seems to be a walled fortress middle mile. And the middle mile basically is not being broken because we don't have an effective wholesale market and it's fragmented to a degree. And you can see that replicated where in West Africa, where the governments have been light-handed in terms of regulation. So it's been dominated by the private sector, because when they came to West Africa, and I think that others on the panel will speak about Southern Africa, but I've been to South Africa quite often when I spent my time with Dimension Data. You know, that idea of having a dark fiber association or a pool of fiber you can go to and get neutral pricing doesn't exist in Nigeria. So it's still used as a competitive tool. That is the fiber infrastructure if you do own it. And because essentially they've had to build it from scratch. They were given the licenses originally to just run digital services or voice services. But when they came to Nigeria, they realized that the infrastructure gap is so great that if they didn't build a transmission backbone network, they'll be relying forever on microwave links or satellite communication, which will be ineffective. So what we are doing, I mean, we understand the problems, we understand the issues, but one of the things that in terms of digital infrastructure, the countries that really have pushed and tried to resolve some of the bottlenecks are those that have been able to instill a digital strategy. And I think last year, the tail end of last year, the Nigerian government released a Nigerian digital economy policy and strategy document, which has 8 pillars. And one of the 8 pillars is solid infrastructure, which speaks to the conversation that we are, which is relevant to the telecom sector. And that telecom sector, and that solid infrastructure speaks to the Nigerian broadband plan of 2020-2025. Remember, we did have a broadband plan earlier, 2013 to 2018, but many of the targets were missed. I mean, you know, in terms of our aspirations, where we'd have infracos introduced to break down that monopoly or the fortress that I've spoken about. But they obviously, maybe due to lack of funding, obstacles in terms of rights of ways, the lack of political will to expedite the implementation of the broadband plan has created another broadband plan that we're currently trying to implement that tries to fix some of those problems. But one of the main areas, and I think that's across all of West Africa, is post-COVID-19. We've realized that we have bottlenecks in our networks. There's differences in traffic patterns, and I think this is across the whole world where people are working from home, and we haven't invested enough in that fixed broadband network. You know, in Nigeria, for instance, I can speak to Nigeria, we have less than 1% FWA, 1% less, maybe even there's no copper, so you don't get any copper. So FTTX to homes or to buildings is still very minimal. And I'll try and put a percentage, maybe less than 3% of deployment. So predominantly we are mobile technology, a mobile network environment. So we have close to 200 million subscriptions, you know, and that is on the back of a multi-SIM environment. So you can see where the focus is and where the dollars are chasing. If it isn't to try and fix the fiber backbone network issue, which we're still going, and we want a Nigerian broadband network that is harmonious, then it's really how do we now increase the subscription rates on the networks, as opposed to stepping back and saying, look, holistically, is this the right way to go? Do we put all the services on the mobile networks? So things like digital financial services hasn't really picked up a lot in Nigeria, but it's been a success in Ghana, for instance. Interoperability works over there, and maybe not as great as Kenya's M-Pesa model, but there's an attempt to reach those that are financially excluded. So there's a lot of dynamics going on. So I would say in terms of digital infrastructure, it's still emerging. It's still early adoption. I think government is becoming more aware about the concept around digital economy, but have we translated that into big bucks, and has that really resulted in this huge rush of infrastructure that will solve the bottlenecks that we've well known and identified to be able to create a platform for digital economy for the future? So I'll stop there because I don't want to hog the limelight, but that's just as an intro. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oli. It was very interesting, and I took note of your mobile first or almost mobile only comment, and I want to get back to that throughout our conversation. But first, I want to ask Andreas in terms of South Africa in particular, where you have been one of the architects in the digital developments on the in the country, Andreas, throughout your engagement with Vodacom and now CIVH. So you know this game in and out, and South Africa has been really doing very well comparing to its peers on the continent. We have surely seen, similar to other coastal countries, arrival of multiple submarine cables. Even this year, we have also landed Metis, ACE, going forward, Equiano, IOX, many others to come. So we don't have any problem there. On the national layer, there seems to be quite a good competition as well between NLD, Broadband Infraco, Telkom, DFA as well, Seacom, Fiberco. We have quite a lot of national fiber in the country as well. And we have also seen that competition, particularly with the entrance of DFA and other competitors, metro fibers and all, going into the metro layers driven by the cities, that opened up the opportunity to your Wumatel business with, you know, innovative open access model, taking those fiber to households, and that was followed by many others as well. So today, I mean, thanks to that, I think South Africa has the largest number of the FTTX connections on the continent, which is around 800,000 connections to date. And considering also the fixed wireless access, starting with LTE and all, I mean, we see that number probably exceeding 3.5 million altogether available to households. So that is, though, it's still representing less than a quarter of the households in the country. Comparing to the global benchmark, we still have that gap. Despite the fact that, I mean, we also see quite a lot of interest by the OTTs coming, establishing their own data centers, now their own submarine cables. Very encouraging for the country, but we are still lagging behind that global benchmark, and we still have only half of the population internet users in this country. But where do you think are the challenges still to catch up with the developed world and, you know, lead the technology space globally from a South African perspective, considering all your engagement and experience in this country? How would you take this forward?
Thanks, Bora. Thank you, Anita. I hope you guys can hear me well. The challenges are, I will try and categorize them and, categorize them in topics. I think some of them are very strategic and some of them are lower level operational challenges. Maybe I'll start with one of the most strategic ones is actually to have a national digital strategy. In the country, there are quite a number of documents and policies that have been developed since 2013, broadband policy, 2017, the National E-strategy. Recently, there was a digital skills strategy. But I think what is required is to make sure that these strategies keep up with time, because a strategy does not stop once you've done the document. It has to be updated. So we have to make sure it's updated, it's current. We have to make sure that there's alignment with respect to the different strategies. I think what I've heard from previous speaker as well is the implementation and execution. I think that has not gone very well over the last few years. So I think that's probably needs far greater focus, developing the strategies, but then focus on implementation and execution and measuring and monitoring. So I think that's one of the first areas. You need to know where you're going to go. You need to know why you're going there. You need to know how you're going to get there. So, you have to have strategy and proper policies. I think then secondly, not uncommon to the continent, is just the lack of abundant connectivity. If you borrow the stats that you refer to, if you look in the report, South Africa has 36 million internet connections, 56% of the population. But I think you have to delve a little bit deeper just to check, is it as good as that? So if I start with fixed line, there's a complete lack of fixed line connectivity. We've had ADSL for quite some time, but quality not that great. If I look at the number of high households in South Africa, it's probably 17.5 million households, where you mentioned 800 FTTH connections, out of the 17.5 million households. So there's still a long way to go. Of the 17.5, 10.7 million households on informal settlements. And we haven't even started scratching the surface. So we have to get connectivity to the poorer areas of the country. And sometimes a rich area and a poor area is just separated by one road. And, there are many photos that you can go and look at and see that it's literally like that. So fixed line infrastructure, very, very poor. If I look at mobile has been far more successful, and probably to a degree as a result of poor fixed line penetration. 34 million mobile internet users, 4G population coverage after 8 years now starting to hit 95%, but it took 8 years to get here. So at least 4G is being rolled out. If you look at the number of 3G and 2G handsets in the country, that still exceeds 4G handsets. So you can assume from that people don't really have this type of connectivity and quality that 4G networks would provide. And those people with 2G handsets, I'm sure many people will agree, the internet connectivity is virtually non-existent on 2G handsets. So if I then look at spectrum with respect to mobile networks, I think spectrum is generally an issue on the continent, especially in South Africa as well. It's been a lack of 4G spectrum, although there are invitations to apply out now that will improve the situation. Spectrum will be auctioned, so that is great. However, before all the spectrum can be made available, we have to have digital TV migration, which is also an issue. And then in the ITA, it's my opinion that there's not enough 5G spectrum in the market. And if you really want to do good connectivity on 5G, you need massive backhaul. And talking about backhaul, only 35% of the sites, I estimate about 35% of base stations in the country is connected by fiber. So it's no use you have 5G on the access side, but you don't have the capacity to backhaul the data. So, that's in terms of mobile and fixed line connectivity. I think the third area, and I'll quickly just discuss that, lack of skills and training. World Economic Forum has, they published 10 skills required for 2025, things such as analytical thinking, complex problem solving, critical analysis, technology design and programming. And then there are also the digital skills that we are talking about, more technical, like artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, machine learning, those type of things. In general, these are not being taught in schools. If you look at independent schooling, which constitutes 5% or roughly 5% of pupils, and then some high-level good government schools, I estimate probably 10% of scholars, pupils in this country are taught those skills. And many of them also leave the country because they have the means to leave the country, and the skills are also in short supply throughout the entire world. So, you know, that skills and training, the third area for me. Just perhaps quickly a few other areas. Cybersecurity. I think we underestimate the importance of cybersecurity and the dangers associated with that. Telecoms infrastructure is very strategic. People want to get into the communications infrastructure. I don't think we're prepared for that. You have really, you have a hierarchy of people, the amateurs, all the way up to nation state hackers. And you have someone called ATPs, advanced threat persistent threats, sorry, APTs, advanced persistent threats. And these guys are really, really good, and they spend a lot of money, and they're very patient. It is said that an APT can be in your network or in an organization undetected for 200 days. That is the average. So cybersecurity, I think, a big issue for the country. Then there are two or three more. I think the challenges with respect to deployment of infrastructure takes long, don't get permission to deploy infrastructure. And there's no consistency between approval authorities, in this case municipalities, when it comes to right of ways, etc. And some of them just require expensive methods of deployment. And then the business forums, we have local organizations where there are unfortunately some criminality at stages, which hampers the rollout of infrastructure in specific areas. We have unstable power, which also causes operators to spend more money on power infrastructure when it's not really necessary. Theft and vandalism, big issue in the country. And then finally, we will have to deal with the impact of COVID going forward. And I think those are the main challenges I see in South Africa.
Andries, thank you for that. I just want to elaborate on a few points that you made. In terms of handsets you mentioned, I mean, still 4G handsets are not penetrated to the market to the level of 2G and 3G handsets. And with the reality that now we have over 90% 4G coverage from a population point of view. And although I will come to that as well in your market as well, I mean, LTE deployments have been really accelerating in recent years. Now, there is this investment that has been done by the MNOs that is kind of idle at the moment due to the mobility challenges. And we have seen quite a lot of push, therefore, to drive fixed wireless LTE offerings. And in recent days this year, we have also seen early stages of 5G fixed wireless offerings. So combine that with the electricity power challenges, which, fixed infrastructure is a bit prone to, because your end user device at the home needs to be, or Wi-Fi router needs to be powered up. Otherwise, you don't get the connectivity, especially for the households, the 10 million households in the informal settlements, the power becomes a bit more critical issue. So do you think, I mean, it will mean that those connectivity will be more wireless-based fixed connectivity? Will it be a challenge for fiber to reach a higher number of households?
Bora, no, actually not. And then maybe I can just discuss that. Is if you look in South Africa at the moment, some of the fiber network operators are starting to focus more on the 10.7 million lower income area, or bottom of the range income areas. So that's definitely happening. I think just in general, you will always have mobile and you always have fixed. And to a degree, I also think, power challenges affect both of those areas. It affects the mobile network. Mobile network can go down, fixed network can go down when there are power outages. In the house, households, of course, sometimes it's a bit different, but if you have a fixed wireless access router, or you have your ONT in the house, When those things lose power, you have a problem. So I think in terms of power and the issue associated with power, it's more or less the same. To get fiber to those lower incomes areas, you have to be able to try and build cheaper, which we try and build. You know, as an example, I referred to my previous answer where municipalities, for instance, the metro areas, force you to put fiber in underground, which is of course far more expensive than deploying fiber overhead. And some municipalities, they allow you to build and deploy fiber overhead. So to reach you know, more rural areas, more lower income areas, it is just not affordable to put fiber in the ground when you want to provide connectivity. I have to say though, is the construction of houses, you know, in informal settlements is completely different to the construction and the size of properties in more upmarket areas, and it's much smaller. So 1 kilometer of fiber in a informal settlement covers many more households than 1 kilometer of fiber, for instance, in a affluent suburb. So on the other hand, that then certainly assists in getting cheaper connectivity to some of the underserved areas.
Thanks, Andres. Although in terms of West Africa, Nigeria and the other key markets in West Africa, you already alluded to the fact that most of the investment has been on the mobile space and kind of continue to be that way. And we also see, I mean, as much as fiber-based fixed broadband access has been limited, there has been quite a significant uptake in terms of LTE-based fixed broadband, particularly in Nigeria. What is your view, I mean, on this topic? Do you think, I mean, these markets in West Africa will be predominantly mobile, even on a fixed point of view? Or, I mean, wireless in terms of fixed? Or do you think, I mean, the situation will change and focus will shift to get more reliable or high capacity fiber-based broadband to the end users?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think if we look at the GSMA reports and some of the forecasts that they have for Africa, generally, we currently have maybe about 650 million mobile subscriber users. Then when you add the multi-SIM factor to it, you know, you might be reaching close to maybe short of 1 billion, and that's set to increase going forward. So it's still a mobile story for Africa. And if you were to shine your headlamps in West Africa and you look at the demographics that we have in West Africa, they are very young. Obviously, the population is very much skewed to Nigeria, which is pegging around 200 million estimated, you know, or slightly growing, but forecasted to be about 440 by 2050. So, you know, I think that the technology adoption is more skewing away from reinventing the wheel of digging ground and laying fixed wide line capacity to houses. I think that, like Andre, what he's pinpointed out, the barriers and there's no business case actually to put fixed fiber to local communities where the propensity to spend is far less than if you put it in a city where there are more affluent users. So I guess that influences decisions as to which technology will be utilized in this part of the world. Definitely, I think that the mobile operators are going to increase the types of service they deliver. They might use FWA, as you pointed out, LTE to enterprises, because we've had some form of FWA service offerings to enterprises in the past. There was WiMAX, DOCSIS is still there. So there's some legacy that might be translated from where they are to LTE type based, or LTE-A as well. So we have those snippets, but the affordability issue is a big factor, because as you go out from the enterprises into the consumer space, those that can afford maybe at a tariff rate of $5, $6, $7 per month starts to reduce drastically. I think that in the early stage, later demand stated that you take up all the creme de la creme, and I think that market has been served very well by the mobile operators. So you would naturally feel that to try and switch those consumers onto another type of media is going to be virtually impossible unless it's a technology upgrade. So I think naturally we're always going to be dependent on mobile technology. That's the first thing. And I think with the hype around 5G, 6G on its way, I think that the momentum is there. And I think, when I see the GSMA reports, I think we are going to be a device carrying nation, especially along ECOWAS. If I sort of look at Nigeria, and Nigeria sort of puts the trend, it's a coastal line country. The fixed broadband infrastructure to the landlocked like Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, for instance, are good propositions. And I think that there are a couple of other telcos that are looking at entering the market. I mentioned Orange in the past. I know that there's another operator. I don't want to name them here, but they're South African, are looking to enter the market. And there's another one that's really sort of hovering to see where the best opportunities are. The cost of spectrum is determined by a formula that doesn't make it affordable. And if we are going to solve this gap, and I like what Andrea was saying, let's assume we're not going to use fixed line, but we use it as far as we can get it to, and then to the last man or the last mile, we use spectrum. The problem in Nigeria is that current allocation of spectrum is very narrow, the bandwidth is very narrow. Future technologies need wider bandwidth, but the formula they use only allows the bigger operators with deep pockets to access those kind of spectrum, which defeats the purpose of competition. So we are looking at TV white space, we are looking at community networks to solve this gap that we have in the unserved and underserved parts of Nigeria, because we have noted that 70% of Nigerians live below the poverty line. That's a reality. So if you aren't able to deploy technology, and I think that's why the mobile technology will be the preferred solution, to bring it down to a cost base where you can basically allow those that are in what we call in the market gaps, which represents 114, which represent about 30 million Nigerians. If we don't have a solution to draw them into the market, then what we'll have the haves and have-nots, and then we have this huge digital divide, and that's the main problem. It's more like digital exclusion rather than inclusion. I think that is the main bottleneck that we have, and that's the main reason why we will see that the mobile wireless technology will be the preferred mode of operation to access the last 30 million or so that have never been able to make a voice or even make an internet connection since the revolution of the mobile device has come to the shores of West Africa.
Although that's very interesting. I wanna continue on that line in terms of the digital divide that you mentioned, and it is our reality. I mean, today the reason that we are having this video call rather than being on a stage altogether is the reality of COVID, and which I think, in my opinion, really underlined the digital divide during this pandemic, because all of us have moved into working from home, studying from home, entertaining from home, which is purely connectivity driven. So, and unfortunately, I mean, not everybody has the same privilege of access to this broadband enabled by underlying digital technologies. And definitely, I believe from now on, driven by operators, governments, private and public sector alike, we are going to see a more drive to enable broadband and expand it to the wider population in every country. So with that said, though, I mean, I want to touch base a bit on the impact of COVID and on the industry in particular. And besides the fact that it underlined the digital divide, it also created a bit of probably opportunity in the short term for more telecom companies, because we have seen revenue uptick driven by this connectivity drive in the short term. And it's likely to remain that way because most of the larger companies also announced that they will not require all the staff to go back to offices. So probably people will continue operating remotely from their homes or nearby remote offices. And at the same time, it created a bit of uncertainty, though, to challenge that positive impact, because given the economic uncertainty in the countries, the investment affordable investment in particular becomes a bit of challenge. So how do you think the COVID will continue impacting the ICT market? Probably, Andres, to continue with you, and then come back to Olu to give him a bit of space to breathe.
Yes, Bora, I think you mentioned, the short-term improvements, definitely. And I think it is what it certainly has done. It's probably changed the future of how we're going to work, probably also changed the future even of schooling, education, universities, et cetera, et cetera. But I also think the socio-economic impact is going to be quite significant, and it is probably going to take longer to recover than what we expected. If I just take South Africa as an example, it is expected that GDP drops 5 to 7%, 8%, and it will take quite a number of years to recover. They announced unemployment rate. I think in the last day or two, unemployment is at a record high of 30%, just over 30%. So the reality is, it is really impacting on consumer pockets and people's ability to pay. Just coming back to the industries, there are certainly, to a degree, winners and losers. And I suppose these are also quite relevant, industries that did reasonably well: health, food and agriculture, financial and insurance, telecommunications, of course. But there are also a bunch of industries that are losers: textiles, footwear, catering, et cetera, et cetera. Now, and I think in there's also a little bit of differentiation that you then can look at, as to say, the consumers who are working from home, and although there are greater unemployment, still require connectivity to those houses. So I would say some of the operators or companies providing services to consumers, I think they have been doing fairly well. The mobile operators, the FTTH operators, etc., have done fairly well. However, the organizations that provide connectivity to enterprises did not do that well. It is recovering, but we'll have to see how and when will they be back to normal order intake, if you want to call it that. I think at the moment, on average, compared to a year ago, the demand is 70% of what it was a year ago. So certainly an impact on companies or operators that provide services to other sectors of the industry. And then I also think South Africa, the country debt is increasing, government debt is increasing. We are quite indebted. It could put a strain on capital availability going into the future. And as everyone knows, this is a really, really capital intensive industry. If it impacts on interest rates, if there are impacts on foreign exchange rates, because we buy a lot of our equipment from overseas, this could have an impact on rollout of infrastructure going in the future. So certainly the economy, big thing, the availability of capital, availability to invest, or possibility to invest further in infrastructure could also be impacted over the longer term due to COVID.
Thanks, Andres. Olu, what is the situation, the impact of COVID in West Africa on the industry?
Yeah, very similar to Andres, really. I think that this seems to be an African story. The reliance on extractive industries, especially, has hit Nigeria and other countries that have relied on extractive industries to build their economy significantly. We've seen a reduction in FDI. I mean, yes, there have been some pockets of acquisitions in the payment services side, but in terms of money chasing infrastructure developments, that has reduced quite significantly. There's obviously a lot of challenge, and obviously with power, that was a changeover, I think, that caused the blip in communication. So we have challenges with the exchange in terms of liquidity and unavailability of enough foreign exchange to buy the equipment that Andre has rightly pointed out. We are 100% dependent on foreign technology, and obviously we are in a very capital intensive industry, so I agree with his statement. But I think the key thing, and I just wanted to drill a bit more, what we found is that pre-COVID-19 there was encouraging signs, and I guess it was sort of a ramp up on data usage to a degree, but obviously with COVID-19 that's spiked significantly. We had those mobile operators who obviously control the consumer market benefiting from it. The thing that is sort of a headwind against that continuing is if we get another lockdown, which is unlikely, but what we find is that the propensity for consumers to continuously spend on expensive data, that's the issue, is that it's sort of waning. People are losing their jobs, as Andre has stated, so the ability to sustain that is somewhat going to be subdued. So our Q2 numbers were expected because of the COVID stay-at-home lockdown mandates by government. Q3 is somewhat, now we're starting to see impacts on our profit margin because the cost of running networks is increasing, but obviously the upper rates are going south, and then obviously people are using multiple SIM. Quality of service is an issue because networks are congested. We weren't privy to temporary spectrum allocation during the period like the South African government gave to some of the players in South Africa. We weren't privy to that. So we have a number of recommendations made in the broadband plan to alleviate some of these problems, but it has been, I guess the challenge has been worsened by COVID-19. Not that we've had more positives. I think our industry naturally benefited, but it also highlighted some of the challenges and some of the weaknesses in our digital infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Olu, again, for your views with regards to the impact of COVID in West Africa. Andres, we are coming to the end of the session. Obviously, we can continue this conversation for another day or two. Unfortunately, we don't have time on our hands. So I want to move to the closing comments. I would like to ask you, all the panelists indeed, if you were to change a significant regulation to drive and advance the digital infrastructure in your country, in your region, what would it be? What would be your recommendation?
Yes, Bora, I think the recommendations will probably address the challenges, that I mentioned a bit earlier. And so, I'll mention some of those. I think in general, though, I must also say, relatively speaking, I don't think we have that many regulatory challenges. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but is it a big disaster? Certainly not in the country. That's at least my opinion. So, the first thing that I would do then is to make sure that there's a proper digital e-strategy, national e-strategy, and that we focus on the implementation thereof, so that after we've developed the strategy itself, that we also develop the implementation plans and then monitor these implementation plans and monitor the implementation. And when things change or we don't make some of the targets, readjust and see how we're going to make that. So I think definitely strategy, first thing that I would focus on. I will focus on rapid deployment policy implementation. There is a draft policy out. Elicited a number of comments on the policy, so I suspect there will be quite a bit of challenge against the policy, at least in the current form. But we have to get a policy adopted, and then we have to get a policy, the policy implemented. I think we have to deal, I spoke about the business forums and some of the criminality associated with that. Not all of them are like that, but there's certainly some areas where there's some criminality. So we have to do that. Perhaps doesn't speak specifically to a specific regulation, but also speaks to resolving of a challenge that we're experiencing in South Africa. And then the next thing I would, in terms of approvals, municipal approvals or any other approvals, we'll have to make that far more efficient. We'll have to standardize. Every municipality currently does it its own way. We'll have to standardize how it's being done. So consistency, very important. We have to speed up the approval of way leaves, right of ways, etc. And then finally, we have to find a mechanism whereby the specifications that they place on operators when they do build and do construction, that those specifications are efficient and as cost effective as possible, so that operators don't spend money unnecessarily on things that they don't have to spend on. There is coming to spectrum. I think we are starting to progress with spectrum. There is going to be a spectrum auction and ITA. There are reserved prices in the spectrum auction, so I don't think we can do that much about it. But I think it is good to remember, if you go look at some of the GSMA reports, it finds a correlation between high spectrum prices and then higher pricing, data pricing, and poorer quality. By that, I think, well, what they're trying to infer is that the more you spend on spectrum, the less you have to spend on subsidizing handsets and building networks. I would also facilitate facility sharing to make that much easier, access to affordable facilities. The one thing that I have not spoken about earlier is the alignment of BEE laws and policies in South Africa. So those are close to South Africa. I understand that there's legislation, but we find that the legislation is not aligned everywhere. For instance, the regulator might have a different standard compared to the sector codes in terms of determining BEE and adherence to BEE. So I think it's very important to align those and make it much easier and much simpler to adhere to those policies. And then perhaps one other thing which we haven't touched on, it is data residency laws. With the arrival of large cloud providers and them not being able to build data centers in every single country, it does require data to traverse borders of countries. And in my experience and very recent experience, it is very difficult. There's a lot of constraints around the type of information, the type of data that you have to store in country versus that what you are allowed to store outside country. So as a region, it would be great if one can align the regulatory framework, the laws associated with that. And then lastly, I just want to say is what is important is also speed and execution. So we should not wait too long for these type of things to develop and then get implemented. And that's it.
Thank you, Andres. It sounds like a long list of things to do, though. I hope, we will get it all right in the short term. Although on your side, what would be your recommendation to West African regulators?
Yeah, in addition to what Andres said that is relevant to South Africa, is similar to West Africa, but there are some parts that really sort of step out for us over here. One is digital literacy. I think that one thing that if I was a regulator would focus a lot on trying to introduce science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM as we call it. And I've been told that there's a humanitarian part to it, an H to it as well. I think focus on that just to get citizens comfortable with the transformation that is going on. I think we have no choice now but to understand that the voice revolution was a revolution because there was latent demand, and the inefficiencies of the state-owned enterprises created that demand. Now we have a demographic, and that's the Gen Zs and the millennials who are grown up with these devices. So we need affordable devices. We need to be able to encourage local manufacturing. So there's a focus on local content so that those youth can also be employed. That's the biggest thing that we have in West Africa is unemployment. And the main area is trying to get our regulatory tools adapted and realigned to the new reality. I think that the tools currently utilized in West Africa and especially Nigeria speak to the voice-centric era. We need ones that are speaking to the digital-centric era. So there should be a focus on machine learning. I know we've not had a chance to speak around that. Artificial intelligence, big data, and aspects that I think the OTT players are more comfortable. and then adaptations to new business models. I think that we still are on that journey. And I think in terms of the industry, we need to sort of align ourselves with what the consumer really needs. And I know that there's some great stuff coming our way in terms of NFV and SDN, but it should go beyond that and trying to find the African use cases. I think that the regulators should help and assist so there's a standard that works in Africa and not just adopting OEMs use cases that they've deployed in other areas of the world. So the area finally about data sovereignty is a good point. We know that data is very important. It seems to be the new black gold as far as we're concerned. So trying to understand the digital rights, how we can monetize intellectual property from, we have an industry here called Nollywood. I'm sure you're familiar with it in South Africa or around the world, and then our music industry, because those talents, they will be digitized, and what we need is local data centers, we need local storage, we need improved XPN pairing, so that there's an ecosystem that's created out of this talent that is exuberated by these young youth that make up the majority of Africans nowadays. But on that note, I'm really happy that we've discussed many areas. I think we could talk, Bora, you're right, forever and eons, but we have to close now, but I'm sure we'll pick up another time and talk about how we can make a lot more money out of this potential that Africa shows.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you very much to all our panelists. I mean, it's been a wonderful discussion. And I believe, I mean, there is quite a long list of things to be done, Juanita. From a Digital Council Africa point of view, I think you still have, you know, many years of planning to do to assist industry to drive the digital agenda. And, you know, I believe, I mean, Digital Council have been really, really very instrumental in the development. Particularly, I mean, being based in South Africa, starting with South Africa, but more and more to Africa with its impact point of view. So I wish you good luck on this journey.